The alarm tore through Sunnybrook General at 3:14 in the morning, a code blue rolling out of Trauma Bay. Two like a wave nobody had time to brace for. Cardiac arrest, mass transfusion. A chest that wouldn't stop bleeding. Dr. Richard Calloway, chief of trauma surgery, was pulling on his coat before the second page even finished, the way he always did, because in 26 years at this hospital, he had never once let an emergency beat him into a room. He was wrong about that tonight. The patient was a 31-year-old man named Tyler Brennan, pulled from a highway pileup on the 401, with a steering column injury that had opened his chest like a tin can. He'd been in surgery for 40 minutes. When his pressure dropped through the floor and didn't come back up, the attending on call, Dr. Aaron Whitfield, stood frozen with his hands hovering an inch from the wound, the way a man freezes when the thing in front of him no longer matches anything he was trained for. Two residents stood pinned against the instrument cart. A nurse was shouting numbers. Nobody was answering, and in the middle of all of it, leaning over the open chest with her hands already inside it, was a respiratory therapist named Sarah Whitmore. She wasn't supposed to be in that room. Respiratory therapists managed ventilators, ran blood gases, adjusted oxygen flow. They did not, under any written policy at Sunnybrook General, put their hands inside a man's chest cavity. But Sarah Whitmore had been standing closest when Brennan's heart stopped, and closest had been good enough for her for a long time. Her fingers moved with a rhythm that didn't belong in a room full of panic. Steady, unhurried. Two fingers compressing the heart directly, the monitor catching, stuttering, climbing. "Somebody explain to me what I'm looking at," Calloway said, and his voice cut through the noise the way it always did, flat and absolute, a man used to rooms going quiet when he spoke. Nobody answered right away. Whitfield opened his mouth and nothing came out. One of the residents looked at Calloway like he'd just watched something he couldn't yet put into words. "She moved before any of us could," the resident finally said. "His pressure crashed," Dr. Whitfield called it, "and she was just already there." "She's a respiratory therapist," Calloway said. It wasn't a question. It was a filing system, a label, a way of putting the world back into the order it was supposed to be in. Sarah didn't look up. "Cardiac tamponade," she said. Even, unbothered, the way someone recites something they learned so long ago it stopped being information and become instinct. Blood's pooling around the heart, compressing the ventricles. Compressions on the outside aren't going to do a thing for him. "I need a pericardiocentesis kit now, please." For a second nobody moved. Then a scrub nurse, almost on reflex, set the kit on the tray within reach of Sarah's free hand. She guided the needle in with her non-dominant hand, slow and exact. And Whitfield made a sound through his mask, like he'd forgotten how to breathe properly. 30 milliliters came back dark and thick. Then 35. The monitor began to climb in earnest. The rhythm rough at first, and then settling, fighting its way back into something that looked like a heartbeat. Tyler Brennan's heart started beating on its own again, stubborn and uneven, the way things come back when they were never quite ready to leave. Calloway stood at the edge of the field and didn't say a word. He watched Sarah finish stabilizing the wound, watched her direct the residents in a voice that asked nothing of the room except attention. No ego in it, no performance, just information laid out plainly because the moment called for it. She checked the repair. Whitfield had started before the arrest, and found a section that hadn't been closed properly. The kind of thing that would have sent Brennan back into the ORR within a week if nobody caught it. She fixed it herself quietly, without making Whitfield feel smaller than the room had already made him feel. Then she stepped back, pulled off her outer gloves, and looked across the table at the man who had run this hospital since before she'd finished nursing school. "He's stable," she said. "I see you overnight for monitoring, but the repair's solid now, he should recover fully." Calloway looked at her for a long moment. The room had gone completely still. "Who are you?" he said. It wasn't really a question either, not anymore. It was something closer to an admission. "Sarah Whitmore," she said. "RT day shift respiratory services." And then she turned for the door. Because she had 4 more patients on her list before her shift ended at 7, and the world outside that operating room hadn't stopped needing her. Just because something extraordinary had happened inside it. Nobody in Trauma Bay 2 slept easy after that. Whitfield stood at the scrub sink for a long while, staring at nothing. The residents traded looks in the locker room that none of them put into words, because what they'd just watched didn't fit anywhere in the hierarchy they'd spent years being taught to respect. Calloway went back to his office and sat down without turning on the light. He stayed there in the dark longer than he meant to, thinking about hands that moved like that, about knowledge that sat that quiet in a person, about a woman who had just saved a man's life and asked for absolutely nothing in return. Not a thank you, not a moment of recognition, nothing but the next patient on her list. In the morning he pulled her personnel file. Read it once then again. It didn't look right. A respiratory therapy diploma, standard clinical placements, 4 years at Sunnybrook with nothing remarkable noted anywhere. And yet what he'd watched her do the night before belonged to a different category of person entirely. He called a contact he still had from his reserve days, a man who owed him a favor from years back, and asked him to dig a little deeper than HR ever would. What came back wasn't a nursing record. It was a heavily redacted military file. 8 years of service, combat medic, Canadian Armed Forces, 2 deployments, Kandahar, and later a NATO rotation in Latvia, in places where there were no trauma surgeons, no clean operating rooms, no second chances, only Sarah Whitmore and whatever fit in her kit, and a refusal, apparently absolute, to let the person in front of her die. Commendations. A citation flagged classified details the file simply wasn't authorized to release. It was the kind of record that didn't belong tucked behind a job title that said respiratory therapist. Treated by the org chart like she ranked somewhere below the residents, she'd just outperformed without breaking a sweat. Calloway set the file down on his desk and sat with it for a long time. He thought about the way she'd moved in that room. No hesitation, no second guessing. The kind of calm that can't be taught in 4 years of school. He thought about every morning he'd walked past her in the hallway outside radiology, without registering her face once, and then Richard Calloway, chief of trauma surgery, a man who had not apologized to anyone in a professional capacity in roughly 15 years, picked up his phone and asked his assistant to find out where Whitmore was working that morning, because he had a slow, uncomfortable feeling settling into his chest. The feeling of a man who's just realized he's been walking past the most capable person in his building every single day without once stopping to look. She was on the 4th floor, adjusting a ventilator setting for an elderly man named Walter Higgins, who'd been admitted 3 days earlier with worsening COPD. Sarah was frowning slightly at his oxygen saturation trend on the monitor, doing the math in her head, already composing the quiet evidence-based case she planned to make to his attending at rounds. That his current settings were too conservative, that he needed a different approach before the weekend. She didn't hear Calloway's footsteps. She heard the door though, and looked up with the kind of immediate, unhurried awareness of someone who'd spent years in places where knowing exactly who was entering a room wasn't politeness, it was survival. He was alone. That was the first thing she noticed. Calloway never moved through this hospital without a small procession behind him. Residents' fellows, someone from administration chasing 30 seconds of his time. But that morning he'd come up to the 4th floor by himself without his white coat, which was unusual enough that Mr. Higgins noticed it too and gave Sarah a worried look, as if to ask whether she was in some kind of trouble. "Mr. Higgins," Sarah said gently, "give me 1 minute." She stepped into the hallway and pulled the door shut behind her, then looked at Calloway and waited. She'd always been good at waiting. "I read your file," he said. "I figured you would," she said. She'd known the moment she walked out of Trauma Bay, too, the night before, that someone would eventually go looking. That was how it always worked. Something happened, the curtain shifted an inch, and then somebody went looking behind it. She'd spent 4 years at Sunnybrook keeping that curtain exactly where it was. Last night it had moved and she wasn't entirely sorry because Tyler Brennan was alive, and his pregnant wife still had a husband coming home. 8 years, Calloway said. Combat medic. 2 deployments. You were doing field procedures under fire that most of my residents wouldn't survive watching, let alone performing. That's probably accurate, she said, without pride, without complaint. Just a fact she'd made her peace with a long time ago. Calloway was quiet for a moment. The hallway moved around them, carts rolling past, a porter steering a wheelchair toward the elevators, and he stood in the middle of it looking like a man having a private argument with everything he'd assumed up until 12 hours ago. "Why here?" he finally said. "Why this floor, this job? You could have gone to medical school, PA school, anything. You had more than the background for it." Sarah looked at him steadily. "I came home," she said. "I wanted to take care of people somewhere that wasn't on fire. I wanted quiet hallways and equipment that actually worked and the ability to fall asleep at night without waiting to hear what was coming next. She paused. I wasn't chasing a title. I just wanted to do the work. You saved Brennan's life last night. Dr. Whitfield would have lost him. He froze, Calloway said. He did, she said, carefully, without any cruelty in it. Cardiac arrest for sure do that to people. He's a good surgeon. He froze. It happens, and it's something he can work on. She said it the way she said most things, as a problem with a solution, not as a verdict. Calloway studied her face for a long moment. I want you in trauma surgery, he said. Not as an RT. I want to talk about an advanced practice pathway. Accelerated, given your background. Your service record alone would qualify you for an exemption on most of the prerequisites. And I heard you froze too, quietly, Sasachmanachalan. It was simply an observation, from a woman who didn't seem to miss much of anything. Last night, in the doorway. Before you said a word, he didn't deny it. I did, he said. That's why I trust you, Sarah said. And something in her expression shifted. Not warmth exactly, but a door that had been shut for a long while easing open a few inches. A man who's never once been stopped by something he didn't understand isn't somebody I can work with. But a man who can stand still long enough to actually look at what's in front of him. That's different. She glanced back toward Mr. Higgins's room. There's a patient in there whose oxygen settings need adjusting before the weekend, and his attending's being too cautious about it. I'd like to deal with that first if you don't mind. Calloway blinked and then, very slowly, something close to a smile crossed his face. Lead the way, he said. And Sarah Whitmore, day shift respiratory therapist, combat medic, the most capable clinician in the building, who had never once asked anyone to notice, turned and walked back into Walter Higgins's room. And the chief of trauma surgery at Sunnybrook General followed her in, because that was simply where the competence was, and he had finally learned to pay attention to it. 3 weeks later, the hospital quietly opened a new advanced clinical pathway for senior allied health staff with prior critical care experience. The first person enrolled was an RT from the 4th floor. Nobody who'd been in Trauma Bay 2 that night was the least bit surprised. Tyler Brennan sent flowers when he was discharged. His wife sent a card a few weeks after that, with a small drawing tucked inside from their daughter, not yet 4 years old. A nurse with her arms stretched out wide like wings. Sarah taped it to the inside of her locker door. The only thing she'd ever put up there in 4 years. And she looked at it every morning before her shift. And then she went back to work. Because somewhere down the hall, somebody needed her. And that had always been the only part of the job that ever really mattered to her.